One thing we've all learned is that there is nothing worse than a national dialogue. Very often, after a tragedy or scandal of some kind, we're told by the media that it's time for a national dialogue. Sometimes the dialogue is about gun violence or hate or homophobia or sexism or mental health. And it's always the media that announces this dialogue and the media that proceeds to have the dialogue, a dialogue that always turns out to be more of a monologue. The media talks about the subject and we're all supposed to listen. That's how the dialogues are always meant to go. So this week, we, and by we I mean they, the media, have been having another dialogue, and this one is about violence in football in light of the Demar Hanlon incident. Yesterday, reporters even tried to get the President of the United States to chime in on this subject of violence in football, but they were rebuffed due to the fact that the President of the United States is, well, a vegetable. Listen.
Do you think the NFL is getting too dangerous?
No, look, the idea that you're going to have, you got guys that are 6'8", 340 pounds, running 4'8", 40. I mean, you hit somebody with that kind of force. Now, that's not what happened here. But I just think it's, I don't know how you avoid it.
Ah, well, he has a point. It's impossible to say what his point is, but I'm sure he has one. Over on The View, the football experts sitting around the table had a only slightly more coherent conversation about the topic, but still very stupid. Here it is.
Right? I mean, my kid played football. He was recruited for college, and he got a terrible hamstring injury getting hit. And I saw him collapse to the ground. Thank you. And he went through physical therapy for 6 months. And he realized at that point, that could happen to my brain.
Right.
Yeah. And so he quit. And he quit. And it was a very hard thing for him because he loved doing it. Yeah. But I don't think it's going to turn people away from the sport because, I went to Notre Dame. It's like faith, family, football. It's a big deal, and it's a $105 billion industry.
Yeah.
So, 45% of Americans think that tackle football is appropriate. Wow. Heterosexual men voted the most support for kids doing football, and conservatives were more likely to support youth tackle football. Just saying.
Just saying. Heterosexual men enjoy football, so it must be bad. With a take like that, Joy Behar may have just earned herself a show on ESPN, actually. Meanwhile, the news media has contributed to the national dialogue with headlines like these. Fans grapple with football's violent pull after Hanlon collapse. And we're all complicit in the NFL's violent spectacle. And then the terrifying collapse of Demar Hanlon and the everyday violence of football. But the first place prize for insufferability has to go to the Washington Post article, which is titled, "After the Hoopla, All That's Left is the NFL's Violence." This is written by a woman named Robin Givhan, who has likely never actually seen a football game and couldn't discern a first down from a field goal. But the piece begins with this paragraph. From a distance, from outside the circle of fans and aficionados, professional football is both confounding and enraging. It's America's most popular sport, and it's also deliberately, unspeakably violent. It's a particular kind of violence that's less about accidental collisions, adrenaline-fueled fistfights, or even a singular articulated blow. Football violence is wrapped up in machismo, militarism, swagger, and patriotism. It isn't a sport that thrives despite the violence, but because of it. Now, she's exactly right about the last couple of sentences there, and that's precisely what makes football so great. She goes on for many other paragraphs, continuing to criticize football in terms that just make it sound all the more appealing to many of us, especially many of us men. She says, football is a particularly American sport, although it certainly has fans in other countries, notably in Germany, Britain, and Canada. But the NFL doesn't have the sort of international rosters that one finds among the nation's baseball and basketball teams. There is no American Football World Cup. Football is America's violence. In football, the players wear their helmets and pads to provide them some protection. But all that gear is also a recognition that the game is, in fact, predicated on men injuring other men. They give each other a bruising. They put a hurt on each other. They go to war. Americans love their football. They're loyal to their favorite teams. Fans admire football players' athleticism, their impressively complex tactics, and the competitive spirit of a Super Bowl. But in the last decade, much of the romanticism that once surrounded football has disintegrated to more clearly reveal the racism in the corporate offices, the sexism within the culture, and the enduring physical pain of the game. All that's left is the violence. And Americans settle into their seats for that. They tailgate in anticipation of their volatile pastime. This orchestrated pummeling of another team, the walloping of another person, the winner's victory is a violent one. So, to review, football is violent, macho, militaristic, brutal, patriotic, and uniquely American. This is supposed to be an argument against football, but it ends up being a better advertisement for football than anything the NFL would come up with these days. Okay, that is a better NFL advertisement than any NFL advertisement I have seen in 10 years. And that's the funny thing here, is that the media is discovering football's violence at precisely the moment that the NFL is doing everything it can to neuter and feminize the sport and make it less violent. Professional football, in fact, has never been less violent than it is right now. And yet now is the time when reporters are asking the president whether football is becoming too dangerous. Now, whatever else you might say about the sport, there is no doubt that it is actually becoming every year significantly less dangerous, for better or worse. But even with all the additional focus on safety and the new rules introduced every year to make the sport less physical and less brutal, still it remains a sport, a contact sport, and so injuries are possible. Serious injuries are also possible. Fatal injuries are extremely unlikely and incredibly rare, but still possible. Anybody with a brain knew this already. Every player knows this. We have all always been aware of the possibility, which is why it doesn't make sense to engage in some sort of fundamental reassessment of the sport when the possible thing, which we all knew was possible, happens. Demar Hanlon is a tragic occurrence. It's not new information, though. It's the sort of thing that everyone knows can happen. And so when it does happen, it just doesn't make any sense to say, well, we got to reassess all of this. It's like if there's a terrible car accident and somebody dies in the car. Demar Hanlon, thank God, didn't die and has survived so far. But if there's a terrible car accident and you're sad about the car accident, it doesn't make any sense to say, well, now we have to reassess and rethink of everything about the highway system. Well, it's like, well, we always knew. Why would this? You always knew that there were accidents. So why is this causing you to think differently about it? But putting that aside for a moment, and even putting the NFL aside, let's consider football itself as a sport. Despite any rule changes or updates to the equipment, it is still a fundamentally violent sport. That's true. And that's what it always will be. Is that a bad thing? No, it's not. In fact, it is a good and healthy thing. It is good that football is violent. It should stay violent. It is good to have violent sports. Okay? We should have violent sports. If anything, we should have more of them, because a violent sport like football is, among other things, a relatively safe, and relatively productive outlet for male energy and aggression. Okay, there's a reason why many of the media articles being written and freaking out about football are being written by women. Because football is not, no matter what the NFL is trying to do, football is not for women. There might be some women who get into it, but it's not really for women. It's not for you. You don't understand it. You're not meant to understand it. This is actually a man's thing. This is why violent games have existed in every society going back to primitive times. They are a means of channeling and harnessing male aggression. Part of the reason any boy or young man starts playing football is that he enjoys the contact, the violence, the opportunity to hit someone. Yes, that is one of the things that is going to drive a boy to play football to begin with, is that he wants to hit someone. Boys enjoy violence. They do. That might make your tummy hurt to think about. You might put your hand on your forehead and faint over the thought that boys enjoy violence. It doesn't change the fact that they do. Boys naturally enjoy violence. My sons are constantly wrestling and beating the hell out of each other for fun. My daughters never do that with each other. My boys do it all the time. They love when I join in and wrestle with them as well, which I often do. It's what guys do. It's how we're wired. In football or in any number of similar sports, a boy learns to channel that energy according to the rules and the playbook and in service to a greater good, which is the team. Now, they're not out fighting for their country. They aren't actually warriors on a battlefield. There isn't much really at stake. It's just a game, sure, but the focus on the team, working towards a common goal, utilizing that violent energy in a disciplined and targeted way between the whistles, between the sidelines, this is all very good. We need to have outlets like this. We need to have ways for young men to harness and use that brutal, masculine, violent energy that scares Washington Post columnist and Joy Behar. The problem, though, is that we are steadily removing all such outlets from society. We're giving boys fewer and fewer opportunities to be rambunctious and violent in controlled and productive environments. Instead, we attempt to suppress those tendencies entirely and feminize them, but it doesn't work. It never will. And we again and again react with horror when the male aggression we've been trying to suppress, and which has few healthy outlets for expression anymore, spills out in far more dangerous and destructive and chaotic ways, on street corners, in classrooms, etc. Here's the fact of the matter. You will never have a society without violent men. It cannot exist. It never will. The only question is whether men will be given constructive avenues for channeling and using that aggression or not. If you choose not, there will be a price to pay. We are already paying it. And that is why the people trying to cancel football are instead themselves today canceled. That'll do it for this portion of the show as we move over to the members block, and you can become a member and use code Walsh at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. Hope to see you over there. If not, talk to you tomorrow. Godspeed.